The morning mist clung to the waters of Pearl Harbor like a shroud, masking the greatest naval base in the Pacific as sailors aboard the USS Arizona began their Sunday routine. It was December 7th, 1941, and the Hawaiian sun promised another peaceful day in paradise. Commander Logan Ramsey stood on the deck of Ford Island, watching the battleships anchored in neat rows along what the Navy called Battleship Row. The sight never failed to fill him with pride. 8 magnificent dreadnoughts, representing America's naval might in the Pacific. Aboard the USS Oklahoma, Seaman First Class James Ward was preparing for church services, his dress whites crisp and pressed. The 20-year-old from Kansas had been stationed at Pearl Harbor for 8 months, and the tropical paradise still felt surreal compared to the wheat fields of his childhood. He paused to admire the view across the harbor, where the USS West Virginia sat majestically beside the flagship Pennsylvania. The peaceful scene seemed eternal, untouchable. 300 miles north of Oahu, however, a different kind of morning was unfolding. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered face etched with the gravity of his mission. The Japanese striking force, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers and their escort vessels, had traveled over 3,000 miles in complete radio silence. Operation Z, as it was known to the Imperial Japanese Navy, represented the most audacious naval attack in modern history. The plan had been meticulously crafted by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who understood better than most that Japan's only hope of victory lay in delivering a devastating blow to American naval power before the United States could fully mobilize its industrial might. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew the sleeping giant's potential. "I can run wild for 6 months," he had told his superiors. "But after that, I have no confidence." As dawn broke over the Pacific, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda climbed into his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber, leading the first wave of 183 aircraft. The veteran pilot had trained for months for this moment, studying detailed models of Pearl Harbor until he could navigate the base blindfolded. Behind him, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters prepared for takeoff from the 6 carriers of the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. The irony was not lost on the Japanese commanders that their attack would commence on a Sunday morning, when the American fleet would be at its most vulnerable. Intelligence reports had confirmed that the Pacific Fleet followed a predictable weekend routine, with many officers ashore and crews at reduced readiness. The harbor's defenses, though formidable on paper, were ranged more for protection against sabotage than aerial assault. According to historical accounts documented in Walter Lord's Day of Infamy, the Japanese had originally planned their attack for dawn, but Admiral Nagumo had decided to launch earlier to ensure complete surprise. As the first wave of aircraft lifted off from their carriers, the fate of nations hung in the balance. The sleeping giant was about to receive a wake-up call that would echo through history, transforming a reluctant America into the arsenal of democracy and sealing Japan's ultimate doom. At exactly 7:48 in the morning, the tranquil Sunday silence over Pearl Harbor was shattered by the scream of diving aircraft and the thunder of exploding bombs. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda's voice crackled over the radio as he transmitted the code words that would change history. Tora, Tora, Tora. The tiger had struck, and the sleeping giant was awakening to chaos. The first bombs fell on Ford Island's seaplane base, sending geysers of water and debris skyward. Petty Officer First Class Donald Ross, stationed at the Nevada's power plant, felt the ship shudder beneath his feet as the first explosions echoed across the harbor. Through the porthole, he watched in disbelief as Japanese aircraft, their red, rising sun emblems clearly visible, swept down like mechanical birds of prey on Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma took the first devastating blow. A modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell, converted into a torpedo by Japanese engineers, tore through her hull below the waterline. Seaman James Ward, who had been admiring the peaceful morning just minutes before, found himself thrown against a bulkhead as the massive battleship began listing to port. Water rushed through the gaping wound, and emergency klaxons began their urgent wailing. The Japanese attack unfolded with clockwork precision. Commander Shigeharu Murata led his torpedo bombers in a low-level assault on the battleships moored along the eastern side of Ford Island. The shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, which the Americans had believed made torpedo attacks impossible, proved no obstacle to the specially modified Japanese weapons. Each torpedo ran at a depth of just 6 feet, designed specifically for this moment. Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi's dive bombers screamed down from 8,000 feet, their Aichi D-3 targeting the battleships with deadly accuracy. The USS Arizona, flagship of Battleship Division 1, took a direct hit from a converted 16-inch shell that penetrated her forward magazine. The explosion that followed was so massive that it lifted the 40,000-ton vessel clear out of the water before settling back into the harbor as a burning, twisted wreck. Boatswain's Mate First Class Joe George, aboard the USS Vestal, watched in horror as the Arizona's forward superstructure disappeared in a towering column of flame and smoke. The blast wave shattered windows across the harbor and was felt as far away as Honolulu. In that single moment, over 1,000 American sailors perished, trapped in the bowels of their ship as it became their tomb. The USS West Virginia, moored outboard of the Tennessee, absorbed torpedo after torpedo until she settled on the harbor bottom, her superstructure still above water. Captain Mervyn Benyon, mortally wounded by shrapnel, continued directing his ship's defense until his final breath. Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller, an African-American sailor who had been collecting laundry when the attack began, manned a .50 caliber machine gun and fired at the attacking aircraft until his ammunition was exhausted. The USS Oklahoma, struck by at least 5 torpedoes, began capsizing within minutes. As the great ship rolled over, hundreds of sailors found themselves trapped in compartments that were rapidly filling with water. Some would survive in air pockets for hours, tapping on the hull until rescue crews could cut them free. Others would never see daylight again. Above the chaos, Japanese fighters strafed Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, destroying American aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip in neat rows perfect targets. For the marauding Zeros, the peacetime practice of parking aircraft close together for ease of maintenance and guard duty had made them sitting ducks for the attacking Japanese pilots. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft completed their devastating run, individual acts of heroism began to emerge from the chaos that had engulfed Pearl Harbor. The second wave of 170 aircraft, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, arrived at 8:54, finding a harbor already transformed into a scene from Dante's Inferno. Captain Franklin von Valkenburg of the USS Arizona had been killed instantly when the forward magazine exploded, but his crew fought on. Seaman First Class Russell Lott, despite severe burns covering most of his body, helped wounded shipmates to safety before collapsing from his injuries. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Kirkpatrick, administered last rites to dying sailors even as flames consumed the vessel around him. On the capsized USS Oklahoma, Seaman George DeLong found himself trapped in an air pocket with 32 other men. As the ship settled deeper into the harbor mud, DeLong organized the survivors, rationing their diminishing air supply and maintaining morale in the suffocating darkness. They could hear the muffled sounds of battle above and the terrible groaning of the ship's hull as it settled on the bottom. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a symbol of American determination. Chief Quartermaster Robert Sedbury, finding all the ship's officers either killed or wounded, took command of the helm. As the Nevada steamed toward the harbor entrance, she became the primary target for the second wave of Japanese bombers. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, despite being wounded, directed the ship's anti-aircraft fire from the bridge, realizing that the Nevada might sink in the harbor channel and block the entrance. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taussig ordered the ship to be beached at Hospital Point. As the great battleship ran aground, her guns continued firing at the attacking aircraft. Taussig, who had lost his left leg to a bomb fragment, refused medical attention until all his men were cared for. At Hickam Field, Technical Sergeant William Schick, rallied the surviving ground crews to push undamaged aircraft to safety, despite continuous strafing runs by Japanese Zeros. Schick and his men managed to save several bombers and fighters from destruction. When a Zero made a low pass over the field, Schick stood his ground and fired his pistol at the aircraft, knowing full well the futility of the gesture, but determined to fight back with whatever weapons he had. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was in dry dock and thus protected from torpedo attack, but she was not immune to the dive bombers. Yeoman Second Class Charles saw organized damage control parties as bombs rained down on the dry deck when a bomb struck the Pennsylvania's boat deck, killing several sailors. Sell led the firefighting efforts that prevented the blaze from reaching the ship's magazines. At the submarine base, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey prepared his submarine, the USS Dolphin, for immediate departure. Despite the chaos around him, Dealey maintained radio contact with other submarines and coordinated their movements to avoid collision in the smoke-filled harbor. His calm leadership under fire exemplified the professionalism that would later make him one of America's most successful submarine commanders. According to documented accounts from the National Archives, pharmacist's mate First Class John Carmichael set up an aid station in the midst of the attack, treating wounded sailors as bombs exploded around him. When his medical supplies ran low, he improvised bandages from torn clothing and used whiskey from the ship's stores as antiseptic. His actions saved dozens of lives that morning. By 10 o'clock that morning, the last Japanese aircraft had disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented devastation. The statistics were staggering: 2,400 Americans killed, over 1,000 wounded, and the Pacific Fleet's battle line essentially destroyed. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous smaller vessels. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the submarine base pier surveying the wreckage of his command. The proud battleships that had represented American naval power just hours before now lay broken and burning in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona was a total loss, her superstructure a twisted mass of steel barely visible above the oil-slicked waters. The USS Oklahoma lay capsized, her red bottom exposed to the Hawaiian sun like a wounded whale. The human cost was even more devastating than the material losses. Aboard the Arizona alone, over 1,000 sailors had perished, including Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, the first American flag officer to die in World War II. The ship's band, which had been preparing for a concert that evening, was wiped out to a man. Their instruments, recovered from the wreckage months later, bore silent testimony to the lives cut short that morning. Captain Casson Young of the USS Vestal had been blown overboard by the Arizona's explosion, but swam back to his ship to direct firefighting efforts. Despite being wounded and suffering from shock, Young refused medical attention until his vessel was safe. His actions that day would later earn him the Medal of Honor, though he would not live to receive it, dying in the Battle of Guadalcanal the following year. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise beyond their wildest expectations, but they had also made critical errors that would haunt them throughout the coming war. Admiral Nagumo's decision not to launch a third wave meant that Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, submarine base, and repair shops remained intact. The oil tanks alone contained 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, enough to power the Pacific Fleet for months. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the attack plan, had argued for targeting these facilities, but Nagumo was concerned about American counterattacks and the safety of his carriers. This conservative decision would prove costly, as the undamaged infrastructure allowed the U.S. Navy to recover far more quickly than the Japanese had anticipated. Perhaps most significantly, the 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were not in harbor during the attack. The Enterprise and Lexington were at sea delivering aircraft to Wake Island and Midway, while the Saratoga was undergoing maintenance in California. These vessels would form the backbone of America's counteroffensive in the Pacific, proving that The age of the battleship was ending, and the age of the aircraft carrier had begun. As rescue operations continued throughout the day, the full extent of the disaster became clear. The USS West Virginia had settled on the bottom, with her superstructure still above water. But she was flooded and would require months of repairs. The USS California was slowly sinking, her crew working frantically to save what they could. The USS Tennessee was trapped behind the sunken West Virginia, her superstructure damaged by debris from the Arizona's explosion. According to records maintained by the Pearl Harbor History Associates, the attack had succeeded beyond Japanese expectations in terms of immediate damage, but it had also awakened a determination in the American people that would ultimately prove unstoppable. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received word of the attack while having lunch at the White House with his close advisor Harry Hopkins. The initial reports were fragmentary and almost unbelievable. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, America's most important naval base in the Pacific. As more details arrived throughout the afternoon, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who had initially dismissed early reports as confusion, found himself facing the greatest naval catastrophe in American history. The carefully constructed neutrality that had kept America out of the European war for over 2 years had been shattered in less than 2 hours. The isolationist movement, which had been so powerful just that morning, was now politically dead. In Hawaii, Territorial Governor Joseph Poindexter declared martial law as reports of Japanese invasion forces circulated throughout the islands. The attack had been so sudden and overwhelming that many believed it was merely the prelude to a full-scale invasion. Civilians fled inland, and military units prepared for beach defenses that would never be tested. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would later command the Pacific Fleet, was attending a concert in Washington when news of the attack reached him. The quiet, methodical officer who had spent his career in submarines would soon find himself tasked with rebuilding the Pacific Fleet and taking the war to the Japanese Empire. His appointment to replace Admiral Kimmel would prove to be one of Roosevelt's most inspired decisions. The rescue operations at Pearl Harbor continued throughout the day and into the night. The USS Oklahoma, lying capsized in the harbor, became the focus of desperate efforts to save trapped sailors. Cutting torches worked around the clock, guided by the tapping of men trapped in air pockets within the hull. Of the 415 men aboard the Oklahoma when the attack began, only 32 would be rescued from the overturned hull. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, the senior surviving officer aboard the Arizona, organized the evacuation of wounded sailors from the burning battleship. Despite being wounded himself, Fuqua remained at his post until the last man was evacuated. His actions that day would earn him the Medal of Honor, and he would later command the USS Astoria in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. The Japanese submarine component of the attack, often overshadowed by the aerial assault, had also met with disaster. 5 midget submarines had been launched from mother ships outside the harbor, but only one succeeded in penetrating the defensive nets. The I-16, commanded by Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, ran aground on a beach near Bellows Field, where Sakamaki became the first Japanese prisoner of war. Radio intercepts revealed the success of the attack to listeners throughout the Pacific. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur received word that Pearl Harbor had been attacked, but incredibly, his air force was caught on the ground 9 hours later when Japanese bombers struck Clark Field. The pattern of surprise and devastation was being repeated across the Pacific as the Japanese Empire launched its coordinated offensive. According to contemporary accounts documented in the Roosevelt Presidential Library, the president worked late into the night on his speech to Congress, crafting the words that would unite the American people behind the war effort. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The sleeping giant was indeed stirring, and its awakening would shake the world. In Detroit, automobile factories were already receiving calls about converting to war production. In shipyards from Maine to California, Plans were being drawn up for the greatest naval expansion in history. The industrial might that had lifted America from the Great Depression would now be turned toward a single purpose: victory in the Pacific. The next morning, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress in the House chamber, his voice carrying the weight of a nation's outrage and determination. The president, who had struggled to bring America into the war against fascism, now found himself addressing a Congress united in its resolve for revenge. The speech lasted only 6 minutes, but its impact would resonate for generations. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God, Roosevelt declared. The vote for war was overwhelming, 82-0 in the Senate, with only one dissenting vote in the House. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against entry into World War I. Back in Hawaii, the grim work of recovery continued. The USS Arizona, still burning and settling deeper into the harbor mud, had become a tomb for over 1,000 American sailors. The ship's flag, somehow still flying despite the devastation, had become a symbol of American resilience. Captain Isaac Kidd, the Arizona's commanding officer, was found at his post on the bridge, killed instantly when the forward magazine exploded. The salvage operations represented one of the most challenging engineering projects in naval history. The USS Oklahoma, lying bottom up in 35 feet of water, required the construction of enormous winches and pulley systems to right her hull. The operation would take nearly 2 years and cost more than the ship was worth, but it was undertaken as much for the symbolic value as for practical purposes. Commander Edward Raymer led the diving operations to recover bodies from the sunken ships, working in the oil-contaminated waters, often in complete darkness. These divers faced hazards that would have challenged the most experienced commercial salvors. The water was filled with debris, fuel oil, and the constant threat of shifting wreckage. Many of the bodies they recovered were found at battle stations, testimony to the courage of sailors who had fought until the end. The USS Nevada, beached at Hospital Point, became a symbol of American determination. Despite taking significant damage from the second wave of Japanese attackers, she had gotten underway and fought back. Her crew's decision to beach the ship rather than risk blocking the harbor entrance showed the kind of clear thinking under pressure that would characterize American naval operations throughout the war. The intelligence failure that had made the attack possible became the subject of intense investigation. The Army's radar station at Opana Point had detected the incoming Japanese aircraft but was told to ignore the contact, as a flight of B-17 bombers was expected from the mainland. The tragedy of errors that led to America's unpreparedness would result in the relief of both Admiral Kimmel and General Walter Short. The Army commander in Hawaii, Lieutenant General Walter Short, had concentrated his aircraft at Wheeler and Hickam Fields as protection against sabotage, never imagining that aerial attack was possible. The neat rows of P-40 fighters and B-18 bombers made perfect targets for the Japanese strafers. Of the 149 military aircraft on Oahu, only 52 remained operational after the attack. The Japanese had also targeted the submarine base, but their attacks were less effective against the underwater vessels. The USS Tautog, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Joseph Willingham, was one of the few American vessels to fight back effectively during the attack. Her crew manned the deck guns and claimed to have shot down a Japanese aircraft, though this was never confirmed. As documented in the official Navy Department communiques, the attack had achieved its immediate objective of neutralizing the Pacific Fleet's battle line, but it had also guaranteed that the United States would enter the war with a unified population and unlimited determination. The Japanese had awakened a sleeping giant, and now they would face the consequences of their audacious gamble. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the consequences of Admiral Yamamoto's bold gamble became clear at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese admiral's prediction that he could run wild for 6 months proved prophetic. As American industrial might and determination began to turn the tide of the Pacific War, the carriers that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga formed the backbone of the force that would hand Japan its first decisive defeat. The salvage operations at Pearl Harbor became a testament to American engineering and determination. The USS West Virginia, California, and Tennessee were all raised, repaired, and returned to service, participating in the climactic battles of the Philippine Sea and Light Gulf. The Nevada, after extensive repairs, would bombard the beaches of Normandy and later support the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Only the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma were beyond salvage. The Arizona was left as a permanent memorial to the men who died there, her hull serving as the foundation for the memorial that would honor the fallen. The Oklahoma, despite being raised and righted, was too damaged to return to service and was eventually scrapped. The ship that had been a symbol of American naval power became a symbol of American sacrifice. The human cost of the attack extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Families across America received the dreaded telegram, informing them that their sons, husbands, and fathers had been killed or wounded at Pearl Harbor. The Gold Star Mothers, as they came to be known, became symbols of American sacrifice and determination. Their grief fueled the war effort and reminded the nation of the price of freedom. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the first wave of attackers, survived the war and later became a Christian missionary, dedicating his life to peace and reconciliation. He would return to Pearl Harbor in 1952, not as a conqueror but as a man seeking forgiveness. His transformation from warrior to peacemaker symbolized the possibility of redemption. Even after the most devastating conflicts, the strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate military impact. The attack united the American people behind the war effort in a way that no political speech or propaganda campaign could have achieved. The isolationist movement, which had been so powerful before December 7th, simply evaporated overnight. America was now committed to total war against the Axis powers. The industrial mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor was unprecedented in human history. The arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised became reality as American factories produced more ships, aircraft, and weapons than the rest of the world combined. The same industrial capacity that had created the consumer economy of the 1920s and 30s was now turned toward the single purpose of victory. The technological advances spurred by the war effort would reshape the post-war world. Radar, sonar, jet engines, and eventually nuclear weapons all emerged from the crucible of World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not only awakened a sleeping giant, but had also accelerated the development of technologies that would define the modern world. The memorial built over the USS Arizona became one of America's most sacred sites, visited by millions of people from around the world. The names of the 1,177 men who died aboard the ship are inscribed in marble, a permanent reminder of the price of freedom. Oil still seeps from the Arizona's fuel tanks, creating what has been called the tears of the Arizona, according to historical records maintained by the Pearl Harbor National Memorial. The attack fundamentally changed America's role in the world. The United States emerged from World War II as a global superpower, committed to preventing future Pearl Harbors through strength and vigilance. The lesson of December 7th, 1941, was clear. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the cost of unpreparedness can be measured in human lives. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared to awaken proved to be everything he had imagined and more. The attack on Pearl Harbor had succeeded tactically but failed strategically, bringing the United States into the war with a unified population and unlimited determination to achieve total victory. The bold Japanese strike had indeed awakened a sleeping giant, and the world would never be the same.